Hello and welcome to Endemic Times. My name is Amira. For the past several weeks, there have been massive protests taking place in Israel. People have been coming together to protest the far-right regime of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. These protests are centered around the far-right regime's plans to essentially eliminate the power of the Supreme Court, which is the only somewhat moderator within the Israeli government. Many fear an absolute takeover of control of the government by Netanyahu. It is important to point out that the people of Israel did vote for Benjamin Netanyahu via a majority, but now it seems, as many people are experiencing here in the US, people are having voter regret because even far-right voters are finding Netanyahu's actions extreme, fearing a demolishing of democracy that Israel reportedly has. People have been out on the streets rallying, and for probably the first time ever, Israelis are actually clashing with IDF soldiers and experiencing just a tiny taste of what it's like to be a Palestinian in Israel. I'm not going to be discussing in detail the Palestinian and Israeli crisis that is happening in the country right now, but if you do want more information on that, you can check out this video, which I have linked in the description box below. What I want to focus on is not only the protests that are happening in Israel and what those protests are centered around, but I want to show you the very many parallels that are happening in Israel that practically mirror what's happening here in the US. From political party opposition, political corruption, warring divisions between progressives and leftists, the very high possibility of a financial downturn in Israel because of Netanyahu's proposed changes, and how that will affect us here in the US. There is a very close connection between the US and Israel, and our futures are too closely linked to each other, meaning if they go down, we go down too. It's a lot, yes, but these are the things that we need to be paying attention to, because if we don't, we won't be prepared. So hit that like button to appease the algorithm gods, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on the critical information that is provided here every week to give you the power and knowledge that you need to understand the bigger picture. Now let's get into it. Thousands of Israelis and even Palestinians are standing side by side calling out Netanyahu, his far-right regime and government takeover attempts that are very close to succeeding in eliminating their Supreme Court and allowing what is now his far-right political majority in power to make laws, get rid of laws, and essentially have a complete takeover of the government, the economy, and the people. The people aren't having it, at least for now, which is leading to protests and riots in the streets, as seen here.
To protest the changes which are being done to our judiciary system, to severely limit its independence and to destroy its integrity and destroy our democracy, basically.
They want to change the whole democratic system and to ruin our justice system, and we are trying to stop that with all our democratic means.
Undeterred by the heavy police presence and stun grenades, protesters blocked roads and scuffled with police in Tel Aviv on Wednesday morning, incensed by a controversial plan to overhaul the Israeli judicial system.
Born in Israel, I fought for 30 years in this country to save this country. Now I'm fighting against the dictatorship that's going to happen here. I won't let it happen. I won't let it happen.
We're blocking all the intersections. We're stopping the entire traffic in the entire country in hope that the current government will understand that we're that serious, and we will do everything in our power to change the current path that they're taking.
Every person here is trying to keep Israel a democracy. And if the current government will get its way, then we are afraid that we will no longer be a democracy or a free country.
The reforms have sparked a storm in the country. It's now facing one of the largest protest movements in its history.
These massive rallies taking place in Israel are against the Prime Minister's judicial reform attempts. Protesters say the reforms are aimed at dismantling the regime's judicial system across multiple fronts. The reforms rob the regime's highest court of the ability to strike down decisions made by Netanyahu's far-right cabinet and Knesset, the Israeli parliament. Parliament would be empowered to amend the so-called basic laws which constitute the regime's quasi-constitution in any way it seems fit. The legislature will also be enabled to overrule the court's decisions with a simple majority of 61 votes in the 120-member body. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition government has 64 seats in the 120-member chamber. This means that Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition government has the majority, which is why people are now in such a panic, because that majority can now basically do whatever they want at the whim of Netanyahu. Looking at this in terms of what this looks like in the US, take Manchin and Sinema, for example, because they were on the side of Democrats, but too often are working against the Democrats. The slim majorities that Democrats had were subverted by Manchin and Sinema because they wouldn't vote. So in Israel, looking at Netanyahu's cabinet, do we really think they're not all going to just fall in line? I don't think so, and the people of Israel don't think so either, which is why they are protesting. This is a majority, and there is cohesion among the far-right administration, so they are going to move in lockstep with each other, meaning that 61 requirement will be met for every single reform that Netanyahu wants. There have been clashes amongst members of parliament that are seeing their power quickly dwindling.
Inside an Israeli parliamentary committee Monday, some members chant shame, while others trade calls of fascist or traitor. Outside, tens of thousands shout democracy. But in a rare intervention, President Isaac Herzog warned in a speech Sunday that the changes come with great risks.
We are long past being in a political argument. Rather, we are on the brink of constitutional and social collapse. We all feel that we are barely a moment away from a collision, and even from a violent collision.
There are many opinions as to why Netanyahu is doing this judicial overhaul, with many pointing to his corruption cases for bribery, fraud, and breach of trust.
Netanyahu, currently on trial on corruption charges which he denies, says the changes are needed to restore balance in the system and curb activist judges who have overreached their powers to interfere in the political sphere. Critics say the plans risk destroying democratic checks and balances and isolating Israel internationally by weakening the courts, handling unbridled power to the executive, and endangering human rights and civil liberties. Here's opposition leader and former Prime Minister Yair Lapid.
They are pretending that they cannot hear. They pretend that they are not afraid. But they can hear, and they are afraid. We will not hide in the houses as they try to turn the state of Israel into a dark dictatorship and shut us up. They will not shut us up.
They will not shut us up. Are you sure about that? Have you met the IDF? Have you met Zionist Israel and how they treat people that aren't them? I would have a lot more sympathy for the people of Israel if there wasn't this huge hypocritical cloud covering everything they do and say in their current outraged state against Israel, and specifically Netanyahu. But I digress. People believe, for good reason, that Netanyahu is using this power to eliminate these cases against him. I can't help but see a lot of similarities here to when the Democrats and the left here in the US, when Trump won, who saw this type of maneuver that Netanyahu is doing as something Trump was going to do with his power as president. They were afraid that Trump was going to use the power of the office of president to obfuscate and obliterate our entire system. He didn't do that, and why he wasn't able to do that is because of the separation of government powers that we have. I won't go into this in detail, but think of the differences between the executive, judicial, and legislative branches. We have these separations, along with our Constitution, so that one branch doesn't have more power over the other one. It's supposed to be a balance of power, that even when there is a president, their power is not absolute. And most critically, the president doesn't have absolute authority over legal precedent. It's not to say that executive orders don't exist, and it's not to say that presidents haven't and won't go against the Supreme Court. For example, a lot of reforms that FDR did and wanted to do more of were tamped down by our Supreme Court. Good or bad, our Supreme Court is an aspect of our government structure that is part of this balance of power. In Israel, they don't have a constitution, so their government structure is more narrow than our own, and the possibility of something like this, an almost complete takeover of the government, and the use of that hold of the government to inflict draconian, archaic, and highly conservative laws is a big fear that Israelis are seeing as a big red flag. Unfortunately, a lot of them are responsible for this because they voted for Netanyahu, but some of that comes from voter fatigue, which I will get into in a bit. The concern in Israel with Netanyahu is that these reforms will curtail the jurisdiction of these sitting judges, which Netanyahu says have too much power. And the president of Israel's Supreme Court, Esther Hayut, has condemned the so-called reforms as an assault on the independence of the judiciary. Netanyahu is actively working to dismantle Israel's fragile checks and balances to give unprecedented powers to the executive and legislative branches. Netanyahu's plans involve giving the Knesset, which is Israel's legislative branch, the power to override court rulings with a simple majority of 61 lawmakers out of 120, including legislation struck down by the Supreme Court for constitutional reasons, to greater government power in appointing justices, and having ministers appoint their legal counsels and not from the Justice Ministry. Remember that Netanyahu's party has a 64-member majority. That's why this is such a big red flag. Netanyahu's government has the majority, and that majority is aiming at eliminating the power of the Supreme Court so as to gain power among their legislative and executive government. But the separation between the legislative and executive is almost non-existent. Israel's liberal society, which is the Supreme Court, is seen as the only institution that can curb governmental actions and legislation passed by a parliamentary majority. This is why what Netanyahu is doing is so important to pay attention to, and why it's scary, because he is using his now formed majority to overturn the part of the government that is the only somewhat balanced measure of power over his own, to get rid of it, dismantle it, or cripple its power completely. Again, think of all of the fears that people had when Trump was in office and what they thought he was going to do with that power. That's actually happening in the country that billions of US taxpayer money goes to. I bring this up because some might feel that this is all far away and has nothing to do with us. Oh, sweetie, it most certainly does. Going deeper into this, another concern that Israelis have is that Netanyahu, as mentioned before, is doing this to get out of his ongoing trial for bribery and corruption, but to also enable Ari Deri, the leader of the Orthodox Party Shas, to be appointed as a cabinet minister despite being convicted and sentenced to a suspended prison term. This would create an untethered right-wing Orthodox government with a majority in parliament that will be able to disqualify Arab parties from running, annex the West Bank without giving rights to Palestinians, give surplus budgets for preferred sectors, discriminate against LGBT and other marginalized communities, crush state education, dismantle social services, and silence dissent. This announcement is what made school teachers become the first ones to take a real risk. Over 660 teachers announced that they won't cooperate with educational programs that contradict democratic values. Their announcement came shortly after the External Education Programs Unit was handed over to Moaz, who is known for his anti-LGBT attitudes and his approach against progressive ideas, such as women serving in combat roles in the IDF. I can't get over how similar this all is to how people feel here in the US about our government, the power structures, the fear around ultra-conservative or even ultra-woke policies that people see as putting others at risk. What do you think? Let me know down in the comments below. Is this just me, or do you see any other similarities here as well? The heightened pendulum swing to the right, now that Orthodox parties have unprecedented power. They're demanding more concessions from liberal society. The United Torah Party has secured extra funding for their communities, especially men who don't work and don't serve in the army. This is a measure that will increase the burden on working taxpayers. More so, Netanyahu giving power over to schools to Avi Moaz, who has claimed that forms of liberal religion are darkness that must be expelled, and whose party had a list of LGBTQ media workers. An even bigger fear that will have likely civil war-style repercussions leading to more death and destruction for Palestinians is that this government will exact revenge on the left, Arab citizens of Israel, and Palestinians. Under Netanyahu's previous reign, many voices on the left were marginalized, attacked, and muzzled, which is why so many are fearing this new regime. Israelis did vote for this coalition, polls show, but so far, the majority aren't backing his agenda to weaken the judiciary. Even for the many who voted for him, the specter of the coalition has served as a rude awakening. Netanyahu is working a propaganda campaign to depict those that are against the provisions as extremists and even hinting at them as election deniers. Does any of this sound familiar?
Netanyahu's Likud party and its allies have denounced opponents of the proposals as embittered leftists who refuse to accept the results of last year's election that brought one of the most right-wing governments in Israel's history to power.
Do you see what I mean? There is so much crossover in rhetoric, conservative takeovers, heightened aggression between all sides, and a concerted effort to gain absolute power over the government. While here in the US, attempts for absolute power are likely not going to happen, the high probability of an ultra-conservative Republican red wave is much more likely to occur than I think some people realize at this point. Our change over the next 2 years as we enter into the 2024 presidential election, I see a very high likelihood that the red wave that didn't quite make the mark in 2020, as presumed, is going to hit the country over the head like a quick slap across the face, and too many are going to be in shock and awe, wondering why all of this is happening. Look at places like Palestine, Ohio, where it is so obvious that the political calculation of going or not going to Palestine was what made the current Biden administration sit on their hands and have our president not visit the citizens affected by this life-changing event and going to Ukraine instead. People are seeing that. All voters are seeing that. Trump going to Palestine first is a big sign of what's to come. But we're not there just yet. The larger aspect of why this is and will continue to be a problem for Israel is that these changes are affecting several aspects of Israeli society. It's affecting the people themselves, those that will be subject to the ultra-far-right conservative and draconian laws that these reforms are meant to pressure, attack, and subjugate. It's also affecting the economy, which will play a major role on the people in Israel, as well as the standing of Israel in the global economy. As Israel's economy declines, the way of life of many settlers that, while many deal with the threat of violence from Palestinians, have lived a much more privileged and prosperous lifestyle than the Palestinians subjected to the apartheid regime, and that will inevitably get more and more harsh against Arabs. Those that have lived the prosperous settler life will see their economy decline, their standing on the world stage turn, and as many continue to see the brutality of Zionist Israel against Palestinians, Israelis, whether for or against the apartheid regime, will likely receive much more ire from the outer global public. All of these confluence of factors are going to precipitate throughout Israel and lead to dismay amongst the settlers, and too many, very likely, will see this all too little too late to make change. And sadly, this is already starting to happen in real time. On February 6, cybersecurity giant Wiz decided to pull cash out of Israel and transfer its business accounts out of the country. CEO Asaf Rapoport, former head of Microsoft's development center in Israel, said investors pressured management to take precautions against the uncertainty over the planned judicial reform. Papaya Global, a global payroll and payment management platform based in Israel, plans to withdraw all of its funds from the country. Israel's VC Disruptive and Disruptive AI have previously announced a similar decision. It's not like these companies are doing this for moral reasons, as this article tries to pose as part of the reason. No, they are doing this purely for financial reasons, because the fear of a weakening judiciary system in Israel will create uncertainty and reduce the likelihood that foreign investors will inject funds into local businesses. This in turn could force local and international businesses to leave, resulting in severe financial crisis. This is the double-edged sword of voting for someone like Benjamin Netanyahu. The voter fatigue that Israelis have had has led them to voting for Netanyahu, and now they are paying the price. After years of the Netanyahu regime, there's a whole generation of Israelis that cannot even remember how the state looked before the age of populism. 5 election campaigns over 5 years have exhausted the Israeli public. Ironically, of all people, it was Netanyahu himself who woke the opposition from its desperate state of mind. It was thanks to him that the public is taking action. Despair turned into anger, and anger is a powerful fuel. If the proposed measures continue in Israel, Israelis are going to see a spike in unemployment, which will lead to uncertainty. And what happens at uncertain times? People get angry, people get scared, people live in fear. And when you're in a fear state, you don't make good decisions. When you're exhausted by electoral politics, you vote just to end the vote. And that's never a good place to be in, as we are all seeing here in the United States. We haven't had 5 elections over 5 years, but there is obvious voter fatigue happening here in the United States. And this mostly stems from the fact that we continue to get feckless politicians that are only using the power of their office to elevate themselves and inflate their pocketbook. We keep getting pretty platitudes, but once a train derails, floods and snowpacks hit a region completely unprepared, toxic water flows, toxic food, it's a what do we do moment of reactivity. Nothing and none of our politicians act in a manner that is proactive. It's all reactive, which means nothing of substance is actually getting done. The last similarity between Israel, the protests, and discourse that I want to cover is the similarity in tension on the messaging of these protests that is occurring between the organizers, Israeli members of the protests, and their fellow Arab comrades. The organizers of the protests were aiming for a wide base of support, and the protest organizers asked the public not to raise the Palestinian flag and to avoid slogans against the occupation. For the protest to succeed, they say, we need to unite as many Israelis as possible, including right-wing voters. While many protesters agree, others emphasized how impossible it is to differentiate between the occupation of the West Bank and the democratic crisis Israel is going through. Many Arab citizens of Israel decided to not join the protest since it neglects the Palestinian cause and focuses only on issues important to the Jewish majority. For the last several weeks, feuding has been taking place here among the left regarding the anti-war rallies. Countless squabbling and division is taking place, centered around the speakers chosen, the accumulated funds for the event that people are understandably questioning, and by far one of the biggest issues is around people perceiving this speaker and that speaker as actually pro-war or calling people pro-Russia, fascists, white supremacists, privileged white people that are just trying to use all of this elevated media attention for their own gain, etc., etc. Now, while I understand a lot of the discourse and disagreements, the big issue I have been seeing and speaking to on Twitter is the fact that all of this is playing directly into the hands of the elite. They want us to be at each other's throats, not coalescing, finding our middle, and working together for the greater good. Personally, I feel like too many are making this about themselves, their hurts and traumas that, yes, I get, they are real, palpable, and hard to detach from. I get it. But the division occurring amongst what used to feel like a much bigger progressive coalition is widening dramatically. Many people, including myself, feel that this is planned and orchestrated by both actual ops and those that cannot and will not step back from their own individuality and come together. It's not to say that there isn't validity to some of these claims and points being made by the people that are in opposition to certain members or individuals that were part of the rally. But the more debilitating aspect of this entire thing is that we should be able to have disagreements with each other and bring receipts for why we have the disagreements that we have, and discuss those and bring them to the forefront and show the people that watch us, that observe us, that listen to us, that follow us on Twitter or subscribe to our channels on YouTube. It is more important for us to show our subscribers and our followers that we are willing to both call out what is necessary and do it when necessary, but at the same time show that we are able to step away from our own individual beliefs, wants, and hopes to come together and stand side by side for one unifying goal, which is to end the war. This division is dismantling the work that progressives have been trying to make, and it is feeding into the elite cabal plan to keep us fighting amongst each other. So why am I bringing this up? I'm bringing this up because, as mentioned earlier, the messaging at these rallies in Israel has been targeted specifically at the far-right regime's attempts to take over the government. The organizers of the event, while I don't know every particular detail, but the organizers understand that you cannot have rallies against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that include rhetoric of Palestine or the apartheid regime. It's not that they don't recognize the plight of Palestinians, but there is a step that has to be made, and they believe, which I honestly agree with, that in order to get the government to listen, the message has to be clear, concise, and needs to have the support of the far-right voters that voted for Netanyahu. This is an incredibly huge ask, and it makes sense why many Arabs didn't participate. But that doesn't mean that they spent weeks trying to dismantle the protests. These protests have seen hundreds of thousands of people, with the smallest taking place in Jerusalem with over 75,000 people. Imagine if those that didn't like the Rage Against the War Machine rally didn't spend weeks attacking it and just let it ride. I get that some people are going to be upset here, and that is your right. I just wish and truly hope that this can be a signal to the left, the progressives, the anti-war crowd, that if Arab Palestinians can set aside their differences and still let protests go without undermining or countering the protests, we should be able to do the same. Thank you for watching. If you liked this video, please hit that like button, as the topics discussed on this channel are not liked very much by YouTube, so by hitting that like button and subscribing, you're really helping this channel grow and get suggested to others. Thank you again for watching. Make sure you share with those that you think might find this information helpful, and as always, stay safe, take care, and be kind to each other.